Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the yin-yang and the concept of reciprocity. With me is Professor Tom Lombardo, who is the director of the Center for Future Consciousness in Tempe, Arizona. He is also the author of Future Consciousness, The Path to Purposeful Evolution. Some of his other titles include The Evolution of Future Consciousness and Mind Flight, A Journey into the Future. Welcome, Tom.
Hello, Jeff. Thank you.
Pleasure to be with you.
Pleasure to be with you.
I think it's very interesting that the YinYang symbol is very important in the development of your own thought, since it's a symbol that we use here in the New Thinking Aloud series.
Yes, it has been a central archetype of my consciousness since the late 1970s, in fact. And I have explored and thought about it from a lot of different angles, psychological, philosophical, scientific, over the last decades.
Well, that's something you and I have in common.
Yes, indeed.
I developed this particular logo. I even had it painted onto the frosting of my wedding cake in 1978.
Yes. And my wife, she has a yin-yang a yin-yang necklace that she hangs around her neck. And also in my study, I have a image I created on a computer of an evolutionary yin-yang, which I call the rings of reciprocity. So the yin-yang permeates my home as well as your surroundings too. Yes.
Well, traditionally it's thought of as being associated with Taoist philosophy, and one of the earliest philosophies in China. Yes,
yes. In fact, that was part of my study was to contemplate the meaning and implications of it that developed in Taoism. But I also looked at it from not just simply Eastern, but also Western versions of the idea too. And its significance to me lied in it providing a second key principle for understanding reality besides the principle of evolution. It was an idea that I could apply to the study of perception in the physical world, an idea I could apply to consciousness and the nature of consciousness. It was an idea I could apply to time and evolution. It was an idea that actually can be applied to humanity's relationship with their environment and our relationship with technology. So it has multiple different meanings to it, or different applications to it, that I've thought out over the years.
And now you're referring specifically to the concept of reciprocity.
Yes, reciprocity was a concept that I took from J.J. Gibson, who was a psychologist of perception in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, who I studied with at Cornell. And Gibson was considered the most creative and inventive perceptual theorist in the world at the time. And Gibson attempted to develop an ecological theory of perception. And by ecological, he meant an understanding of perception that would involve both understanding the perceiver and the environment as a reciprocal whole, and that in order to understand what's going on in perception, you need to include both dimensions, And Gibson saw the perceiver and environment as a reciprocity. And what he meant by that was that they are distinct, but they are interdependent. Now, when you look at the Chinese symbol of the yin-yang, you find the yin and you find the yang, and they are in one sense distinct.
Right.
They are a duality, but they mesh or align together, and they form the totality of the Taoist symbol, and so they symbolize both plurality and unity or wholeness simultaneously. And so perceiver and environment are both distinct but complementary, and they form a totality or a whole. And so reciprocity I took as a psychologically dizzying concept, as I'll push it a little bit further and push the yin-yang simultaneously a little bit further by saying that the fact that they are distinct is tied up with and necessarily connected with the fact that they are interdependent. That is, their individuality and their togetherness form a unity, a reciprocity. It would be like asking the question of, is the universe a one or is it a many? And the answer is, it's both and necessarily so. Is it both a two or is it a one? It is both and necessarily so. And so, as one implication here, we have the conscious mind and we have the physical world. Are they distinct? Yes, in a sense they are distinct, but they are interdependent with each other, and one can't have one without the other.
And you find that this principle of reciprocity applies to many of the polarities that we think of, good and evil, light and dark.
Yes, it applies to all of the Western dualistic polarities. You can reconceptualize them all as reciprocities, or you can reconceptualize them all in terms of yin-yangs within the Taoist model. Let's take another one, which is a key one, which is stability versus change. And stability and change can be reconceptualized as a reciprocity. So one can't have stability without change, and one can't have change without stability. One of the things that Gibson pointed out in studying perception was that I'm going to introduce a technical term here. The ambient optic array, which is the structured pattern of light that surrounds the observer, when we move our head through it, what happens is the perspectives on the array change, but as they're changing, you'll notice that there will be certain invariants that will emerge through the changes.
Now you're talking about the impressions that exist in the mind's eye.
No, we don't even have to go that far yet.
All right.
We're talking about the fact that in the stimulus array, the physical stimulus array that's generated by the physical environment, that pattern stimulus array, in it, when you move around through it, there will be both invariant properties in it and transformative properties in it. This is where we also get into the notion of the ecological concept of perception. Quickly as an introduction, Einstein once said, the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. Okay? How is it that the universe is structured in such a way that it can be known? And Gibson gave an answer to it. And the answer he gave to it was that the environment, the universe, actually creates a structured, informational, energetically supported display of itself that perceivers resonate into. That is, the universe makes itself known to us.
Yeah.
We have to have the appropriate equipment to resonate and pick it up, but matter is not meaningless. Matter is not unstructured. Matter is structured in a way that it actually can be known, and that's where you bring in the environment into the picture in order to understand what perception is all about. So perception is a conscious mind embodied in this biological body that's resonating with a manifestation created by the physical world of that physical world's nature, including its meanings.
It's as if the universe created us for the very purpose of knowing itself.
Exactly. You got it. You hit it. See, perception is the act by means of which localized observers in a localized self-reflection know the universe that's created them, including themselves, because you're in it too.
Yeah.
You're part of the perceptual experience, which is in fact another reciprocity, as it turns out. You'll notice that in your perceptual experience, there is both the world and there is you. And that forms a reciprocity in the sense that I perceive myself relative to the world, and I perceive the world relative to myself. That's the proprioceptual, perceptual reciprocity or pole. And that's critical to any animate form of life, because I not only have to see or perceive the layout of the world, I have to see where I am in relationship to it, and then I also have to see how I am moving about through it. So a puzzle that comes up in the study of consciousness is how does one locate self-consciousness into consciousness as a reality? And what I would suggest, based upon what I just said, is that self-consciousness is an integral part of consciousness, in that consciousness seems to manifest itself in localized embodied observers embedded in an ambience, and part of that consciousness is necessarily consciousness of the observer who possesses the consciousness in relationship to the world in which they're embedded. So I would say that an ant has a rudimentary level of self-consciousness if an ant is conscious. And I think an ant is, to some degree, conscious, because an ant is aware, at least in terms of the significant things it has to be aware of to get around. Yeah.
Oh, all right. Well, what about, to switch topic a bit,
Yeah.
good and evil?
Good and evil, yes.
Because I think most people are taught from childhood that I think there's the song, I learned to hate the devil and I learned to love Jesus. That's basically it. You hate evil and you love good.
Yeah. And let's take what traditional Western religion and Western ethics. It has always been formulated as this dualism of good and evil, of a supreme good being and a supreme negative being. It is not formulated as if there is a good. It's formulated as there is this opposition of good and evil.
Right.
And if you look at the definitions or descriptions of the good and the definitions, descriptions of the evil side, they're always opposites. Okay? Now, if you stop and think about the notion of opposites, then how can you meaningfully formulate what one pole of an opposite means without it being in contrast to the opposite pole? See, so historically, we have been educated in what's presented as a dualism, when actually, in a sense, it's a reciprocity in our thinking. So we presented, say, love and hate, which are conceived as opposites. How can the capacity for love gets defined relative to its opposite, which is the capacity for hate. And now that's at a moral metaphysical level. Interestingly, the nervous system operates in terms of polarities too. So when I make discriminations perceptually in terms of polar opposites. So dark versus light, up versus down, red versus green, hot versus cold. Okay, and each of those sets of polarities is a continuum, a measured continuum. See, so somebody could say one cannot have the meaningful experience of cold unless one has also had the meaningful experience of hot. See, so the nervous system, the human mind, and our fundamental ethical morality all seem to be built up on this oppositional comparison polarity of
But
things.
I might say that I don't need hot. I might say that I just need not cold. I could be neutral. You could compare cold with neutral.
I can compare cold with neutral. But it sure as hell wouldn't be cold anymore.
Right.
I don't know what it would be.
No, but it doesn't need to be hot.
It doesn't need to be hot. Okay? Let's try this out. We'll do the little experiment. Okay. We have 3 bowls of water. One bowl of water, we'll say, is heated up to a boiling point. One is body temperature. And one is 32 degrees Fahrenheit, okay? Now, this is hot, this is cold, this is neutral in the middle. If I put my hand in the cold water, let it adapt, and I put my hand into the hot water, clearly it's going to feel hot.
Yeah.
Okay, but also, if I put my hand in the cold water and put my hand in the medium temperature water, it will feel hot too, just not as hot as that.
Right.
See? So could I have an experience of neutrality and one extreme when in this particular setup, the thing that I would define as neutral is necessarily going to be experienced by me as the opposite? Another way to put this would be
well, if we apply that to good and evil, for a moment now, let's say, I've taken you to San Quentin prison where I used to do field work, and I introduce you to murderers and rapists. So now you've had an experience of evil people.
Right.
Now, then we go to a department store where you meet the salespeople. There. They're not necessarily exceptionally good people. They're not necessarily bad people either. Let's say they're neutral people. Do they seem like really good at that point in comparison?
They would seem better by comparison.
But if they wouldn't necessarily embody what you would call the philosophical good.
Oh, no, that's because we have examples of what we would call the philosophical good that we can use as our comparison point. If all you knew were the salespeople in some typical store that are just moderately ethically okay versus the evil ones, the moderately ethically okay would look good to us. So I would have trouble with the idea that one could have a mode of consciousness where you had one of the polarities and then had neutral without the other.
Because the principle of reciprocity seems to, as you're explaining it to me, it requires inclusion of the extreme ends.
Well, it requires a polarity. Yes, a polarity there. A polarity that combines together into a whole. Let's see, what's the word I'm looking for here? The word would be a kind of symmetry. Okay, a symmetry. a symmetry of a circle. And we have the north, and we have the south at the top, and we have the bottom. Now, of course, we have the center too, but the idea of reciprocity envisions this as something that is functionally like a circle with complements. And the complements will go to reverse extremes or reverse directions relative to the center. It would another typical psychological experiment is if you put on goggles which bend all the light to the right, bow everything this direction, okay? And when you first put them on, everything looks bowed or curved this way. You leave them on for a while, and you take the goggles off. What would you expect that you would see?
Everything bowed the other way.
That's exactly right, yes, because that has become the new norm. That's become the new norm. And the new norm will define the a point of comparison relative to which the two polarities get defined.
Well, now we're getting to the heart of some of your thinking, because when you talk about reciprocity, I think the real interesting examples have to do with the reciprocity of mind and matter.
Yeah, right, yes. The reciprocity of mind and matter. One way that one could understand that would be to say that the physical world supports the emergence of something that can know it, and the knower, in turn, supports the emergence of a knowable physical world. Now, what I mean by that is that it becomes nonsensical to talk about an unknowable physical world, something that cannot be known, but somehow exists. On the other hand, it seems like it's impossible to talk about a conscious mind that does not have a physical embodiment supporting it. There's a line from a Chinese philosopher, which is that mind is mind because of things, as things are things because of mind. And that each of the two polarities defines this relationship of reality and knowing. Consciousness, as best as I can approximate to understanding it, is experiential knowing. And the physical world is something which is knowable and yet supports the very emergence of the knower itself. We're back to this thing about the universe reflects back on itself and knows itself through the manifestation of localized conscious minds.
It almost strikes me as a chicken and egg problem.
It is a chicken and an egg. And that's where we get into this dizzy puzzle again. See, traditionally, one could have a universe that you saw as entirely physical or entirely mental and spiritual, and somehow or other the other one is some manifestation of it. But if I say that each of the two holds the other up, it creates trouble in my mind when I'm looking for a foundation, something fundamental, when rather each is holding the other up. Going back to Lee Smolin, who I mentioned in a previous talk on the life of the cosmos, Lee Smolin brought up the idea that the entire universe is self-supporting, and that means there's no foundation holding it up. It holds itself up. And so whatever the fundamental constituent aspects of reality are, they are holding themselves up as a mutuality together, as opposed to the old trouble that we had with if the Earth is on a turtle, which of course is supported by another turtle, we have turtles all the way down. Rather, instead of that, we live in a reality that is somehow a self-supporting entity in its totality.
I think the Buddhists refer to that as mutually arising conditions.
Yes, exactly, mutually arising. And mutuality isn't very far away from the meaning of reciprocity.
Right.
Oh, well, go ahead.
We started out our series of interviews, and our viewers may want to check this out. The first one had to do with the evolutionary aspects of cosmology and psychology. And
yes.
I think your thinking, as I understand it, takes these two elements, evolution and reciprocity, and combines them. So
yes.
That's a way to look at how the chicken and the egg problem gets resolved. It started out as, an evolutionary single-celled organism long before there were eggs, and eventually evolved to the point where it seems mysterious and incomprehensible.
Okay. You said a lot of things there real quickly, and my mind was going, and I'm going to try to unpack them.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I do think that you can combine together the ideas of reciprocity and evolution into a comprehensive image of reality. Richard Nisbet, the social psychologist in The Geography of Thought, had a story where his Korean graduate assistant came up to him and said, the difference between us is that you think reality is a line and I think reality is a circle. Mm-hmm. And the line symbolizes linearity, motion, moving forward, mm-hmm. and that's a Western thinker over here, and it was out of the West that we get the idea of evolution, and then the circle, harmony, balance, the Eastern idea, the yin-yang symbolizing it, we get the notion of complementarity or reciprocity, and so one can take those two ideas and fit them together to provide a more culturally expansive and also more encompassing mm-hmm. theory of a reality. So that what we have is we have a process of reciprocal evolution. Mm-hmm. Now, I would not say that there ever is an absolute singular one, because in my reciprocity mind, I know that where there is a one, there is a many. Mm-hmm. Okay? So, I could envision evolution involving a fundamental reciprocity that complicates itself mm-hmm. as it's evolving. Yep. And a second important thinker who I ran into that stimulated me in thinking about reciprocity and the yin-yang was J.T. Frazier, mm-hmm. the ex-president of the Society for the Study of Time. Mm-hmm. And J.T. Frazier proposed that time and evolution, which in his mind in some sense were the same thing, mm-hmm. involved a irreconcilable conflict and mutuality of order and chaos. Okay? And so order and chaos as the two primordial forces, and that's an idea that goes all the way back to the ancient Babylonians and Egyptians. It's mm-hmm. a very old idea. Yep. That those two principles are caught in something like a cosmic dance. And what we see around us is this intricate, elaborate interplay of those two forces continually evolving new forms, yep. but never being able to reach any resolution, mm-hmm. which is why time never stops, mm-hmm. or why it keeps going, because this duality or this reciprocity keeps fueling this process of a continued integration. It also, at a more simple level, would be something like everything in the world we see around us is an evolutionary process, mm-hmm. but it's all interactive. Mm-hmm. So things do not evolve in isolation. They evolve interactively. They evolve reciprocally. So we're evolving reciprocally with our technologies, we're evolving reciprocally with the earth, animals evolve reciprocally with each other, an ecosystem is a complex interplay of many different life forms, and that's all reciprocal evolutions. And so humanity, and relationships evolve reciprocally, and individuals evolve reciprocally with respect to society. So you can combine reciprocity and evolution together into this notion of reciprocal evolution, which is a way to synthesize the circle and the line and flow and cycling and balance at the same time.
And I think it's probably fair to say that underlying all of your thought is this notion of reciprocal evolution.
Yes, definitely. In fact, that's what the image is that I have up in my house, is I have an image of a yin-yang, and in it is a smaller yin-yang, and in it is a smaller yin-yang. And so there's this spiraling effect, what Gibson called an optical tunnel, which is a series of smaller and smaller yin-yangs, which are complicating the yin-yang, which is the fundamental harmonic reciprocity, which keeps playing itself over and over again.
Well, it sounds like you've added a new dimension now, which is a fractile principle.
It's a fractile principle, yes. In fact, if you look at fractals, I think mathematicians could agree that there are elements of both order and chaos in those fractals, but they just keep repeating themselves smaller and smaller and smaller. Yes, right.
Well, Professor Tom Lombardo, once again, we've had a fascinating intellectual journey.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being with me.
Yeah, and thank you, Jeff.
And thank you for being with us.